Hi, everyone. Oops. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talks Live. I'm your host, Danny Norberg. Today, I get to chat with a real legend in the sustainability movement. Helena Norberg-Hodge is founder and director of Local Futures. She is a pioneer of the new economy movement and has been promoting the economics of personal, social, and ecological well-being for more than 30 years. She is the producer and co-director of the award-winning documentary, The Economics of Happiness, and is the author of Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh. She was honored with the Right Livelihood Award for her groundbreaking work in Ladakh and received the 2012 Goy Peace Award for contributing to the revitalization of culture and biological diversity and the strengthening of local communities and economies worldwide. Helena, it is such a true honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
So I just want to start by focusing on your thoughts on indigenous knowledge. How do you think, a lot of us can learn from indigenous knowledge without sort of co-opting or taking a reductionist approach to their practices?
Well, I think it's very important to be aware of the fact that some of that's been done. But I think the fear of co-optation may be a bit excessive now. I think we shouldn't at all be afraid of genuinely admiring and learning from indigenous people. And some of this thinking about co-optation comes from vested interests that are dividing us into tiny little groups in every possible category, as you can see. So we must try to come out with a holistic perspective where we work together to make the changes we need to make. And of course, my learning from indigenous knowledge was all about understanding the importance of local knowledge, place-based knowledge. And, YASTA, that important study, the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development, it showed very clearly that we need to respect the knowledge of local farmers and indigenous people who have worked the land in a particular place, in a particular climate, sometimes for thousands of years, successfully.
Absolutely. And I was so impressed by the ISTAD report that you mentioned. It came out several years ago now. Why are we still having these sort of issues, though? Why don't we respect and promote indigenous knowledge and those practices, even though the science tells us that that is what's right for the earth?
Because I would say that study was squashed. Unfortunately, in the mainstream, there is a sort of machine-like speed and monoculture that's being promoted, and that squashes knowledge that is dealing with the complexity, the diversity of life. And so, as I see it, we're up against a machine-like simplification and speed that's preventing us from understanding that the solutions to most of our problems are right under our nose. They have to do with recovering local knowledge wherever we are, place-based knowledge. Anyone who has planted a garden knows that the soil, even within a square meter of land, can be different. You can plant two plants right next to each other. One will grow twice as fast as the other. Now, we have a system today that's promoting vast monocultures. Even in the name of regeneration now, we have to be careful that what's being promoted is large-scale monocultures for export, not the diversification that we need to first of all provide for local, regional, and national needs, and then trade where it makes sense. And I would urge people to try to become both more ecologically literate and economically literate. Because
Absolutely.
we have a formula in the economy, comparative advantage, which up to a certain point can make sense, but it's been driven home to every country, every region now for hundreds of years, and it's counterproductive. We need to switch in exactly the opposite direction and support localized, diversified, smaller scale farms And we need to make food security, in other words, providing for those home needs first, um, a priority.
Absolutely. I want to get back to the economics point in a minute, but I'm wondering if you think that there is a way to combine sort of high and low technology. And by low technology, sort of, those practices that we're talking about that don't require a lot of, technology and sort of the sense that everyone thinks about it. Do you think we can combine technology with some of the indigenous practices that you've talked about?
But again, technology, it covers everything from a fork or a stick even to mega technological systems. And I think that for sure technology is part of life everywhere. Wherever there are human beings, even many animals actually use technology. So we need to really unpack what we're talking about behind the table. And we do need to be careful to realize that many of the communication technologies that look so small, the mobile phone and now the little iPad, are actually part of mega systems that do use huge amounts of minerals and also are very energy intensive. Most of them not only using lots of energy as we use them, but the whole internet uses vast amounts of energy. In many cases, we're using it for completely unnecessary reasons and also replacing people. So we're
Mm-hmm.
looking in a very nuanced and in a very sophisticated way at this. And of course, most of us now are dependent on these technologies. You and I are speaking on them, and we need to get information out. But I think we need to distinguish between, particularly between introducing them into areas where people are not using them at present and really don't need them in
Mm-hmm.
order to provide for healthy food, for the basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter can be provided in many parts of the world without depending on these technologies. So I would be very wary of creating dependence where there isn't. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
hoping that in the long run, that most of us will become less dependent on them and that we'll see that rebuilding the face to face, the human contact, the deep connections that provide us with experiential knowledge, which cannot be replaced through the long distance relationships. And we're seeing epidemics of depression, anxiety, and other mental problems now, particularly after COVID. And part of that was of isolation. And the
Mm-hmm.
isolation is actually being brought about through technologies that we think of as technologies of connection. But there is now widespread knowledge about the social media being the anti-social media, etc. So I think let's be looking at a picture where we use these technologies where they're genuinely helpful, and that's usually in sharing information for collaboration. It of course is useful in monitoring climate and other issues, but let's not use them where they're not necessary.
Great answer. Going back to that economics point, I'm wondering what we can learn about economics from indigenous knowledge. This is something you spent your whole life sort of doing.
Yeah, well, basically, what I learned, and it did take me many, many years of living in an ancient indigenous culture that hadn't been colonized. And that's a very, very important part of it. It meant that I discovered these people high on the Tibetan plateau in a place called Ladakh, who were still living in an economic way, an economic system that they had created. It was a local economy where they derived all their basic needs from their own land, which of course they often shared. They had the commons still, sharing grazing areas and so on for their animals. It was a very unusual ecosystem up at 12,000 feet, and it was very sparsely vegetated. So I was amazed to find that there was no poverty as we see it in the third
Sure.
world. There was no hunger, and I discovered the happiest, healthiest people I'd ever met. It turns out that the poverty we see in the third world really is a consequence of having been forced off the land to produce for export. So I became aware of the need to strengthen local economies because that's what indigenous people had. Shorter distances between the land and the people that were making use of those resources. Shorter distances that enabled people to have more experiential knowledge, to see the impact of their action. This is not something that's easy to recreate overnight in the West, but it is happening. You know, there is a local food movement, which we have helped to start in many countries. And that local food movement is demonstrating these multiple benefits of local economies, starting with the most important production of all, which is food. Nothing else
Absolutely.
that everybody needs every single day of their life. And of course, we shouldn't have policies where the food we need comes from further and further away. But unfortunately, that's what most governments are encouraging today.
I wonder if you think because of COVID-19, there is an even bigger movement towards economic localization.
Absolutely. Particularly again with that most important activity, the most important economic activity, how we produce our food, which also affects water, by the way. It's, if you're interested in water, focus on food production and agriculture and make the changes that are needed to create healthy, thriving ecosystems. So for sure, I mean, COVID has led to a huge increase, not only in awareness and interest, but so many people have started growing food in their own gardens, on their own balconies, you know, something that we've never seen before in my 45 years of working on these issues. So it's very hopeful, but I would say the problem is that our national governments are locked into an economic fundamentalism that's to do with encouraging more global trade when they should be supporting more localized, regionalized trade. Look at what happened in COVID. Countries can't even make their own masks. And just imagine how important it is that we start making sure that we have that basic food security so that we can feed our people. So I'm hoping that the grassroots interest will now translate into policy change.
Absolutely. I hope so too. I mean, this all sounds awesome, right? If we could have more localized economies, if we could reduce our dependence on global monopolies, but how do we make that shift? How does that happen? I mean, how do we get from A to even B and then A to Z?
Yeah, it does sound so big. It sounds so impossible. But the fact is that it is happening. I mean, in the sense that what we're seeing, because we've been working, you know, my organization, Local Futures, is very small, but we've been working internationally, literally on every continent. And so we have contact with the grassroots on every continent and work more closely in about a dozen countries. And what we're seeing is that the grassroots knowledge that we must take care of the soil and the water and that the food economy is the most important one. There is a micro trend from the bottom up that's growing worldwide. And it's so inspiring because it heals so many problems at the same time. Because as we start supporting smaller businesses, smaller diversified farms, diversity on the land instead of monoculture, we actually start healing the land. And there's a shift towards organic without having to have the organic label. There's
Mm-hmm.
away from the chemicals naturally when you're allowed to do diversified production. So we have countless small examples around the world. And what's beginning to happen is that the reality of on the ground change is now reaching local governments. So there are many mayors around the world. There are regional governments that are beginning to support these local food economies. And so it's starting to happen. What do we need to do to make it happen on a bigger scale? It's what I call big picture activism. We need to engage in informing ourselves and informing others as a matter of urgency, particularly after COVID. What we're talking about with localization is something that is a shift not just towards healthier food, healthier ecosystem, but healthier people, healthier in terms of immune systems, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
strength and vitality, but particularly psychologically. We have so many examples now of people who are engaged in growing a bit of food actually feeling better about themselves. And particularly when it's happening in a group, in a community or a family, there is a reconnection, a deep reconnection to the basics of life, to nature and to one another. It's how we evolved, and people are responding in a way that is magical. We have examples of prisoners, angry, hardened prisoners, who, after a few months of being helped to learn how to grow food in community, are transformed as human beings. We have examples of people with mental illness, torture victims, this reconnection in this fundamental way. I myself am very surprised to see how rapid the healing is, the social, ecological, and spiritual healing, you could say, psychological healing. But I think, again, the more I reflect on it, is because that's how we evolved. We have only lived in this isolated way, sitting in a high-rise building without any contact to the people around us, no contact to the plants, to the animals. It's unnatural. So we're responding very well to a situation that brings us back home, to something that we really, where we belong as human beings. And also, what's so important about this is that the local movement, which is not just about food, is also providing more livelihoods. So it's a way in which we do use technology, we do engage in international trade, and we especially engage in international collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Economically, we're helping to build stronger, smaller businesses to provide for people's basic needs. And in doing so, we can provide many more jobs, and not just jobs, but more meaningful livelihoods, because people are working in a way and with people that is so much more satisfying. What's a perfect example for me is the farmers at the farmers markets, who for the first time, as some of them have said to me, one farmer said, I've been a farmer all my life, but previously we felt like serfs. We were selling to this giant anonymous market. We were pressured all the time to produce at lower price and more standard products. Our avocados were supposed to be all the same size. That's unnatural. Lots of food thrown away and wasted. Now, after you started the farmers market, it's like entering another galaxy, because in that new galaxy, the farmer actually gets to meet the person who eats and enjoys the food. And they don't care if the avocados are the same size or not. They want healthy, delicious avocados.
I love how you've been framing, sort of what happened since the Green Revolution as unnatural, because so many people think that's the way we have to do things. That's the only way to scale. People think of scale as only scaling up, not really scaling out or replicating things. And I think, if you frame it as this, then it makes a lot more sense to people.
Absolutely. I really think that the efficiencies of scale are a myth, and that we can scale up through replication. Replication can occur very rapidly, but we do need also consumer knowledge, activist knowledge about this, because so many things that start off so wonderful. Think of Ben and Jerry's, and there are many examples where when they were smaller and more local, they were doing everything beautifully. The land and the scale of the production and so on, it was all perfect. But as it becomes more and more popular and just grows and grows, it completely changes into a top-down, monocultural, speedy, supposedly efficient way of doing things. But we're losing the efficiency of maintaining the actual soil, the actual foundation of all of life. And we are, with it, we're losing our health. We're seeing an epidemic of illness, and that illness, so much of it comes from bad food, from the processed food, from the sugars, both the high fructose corn syrup, but also all the hidden sugars in food. We're now seeing an epidemic of diabetes and obesity, which, as some doctors have talked about it, it's the second pandemic, which makes you much more vulnerable to death from COVID. And it's a pandemic that we're not dealing with. Why aren't we dealing with it? Because systemically, it doesn't generate profit for big business. Systemically, dealing with this epidemic, this pandemic, would reduce corporate profit. It's the giant corporations that have now, that are in the position of operating globally, that find it more efficient to operate with food that becomes dead and processed, and where so much of the scientific research goes into the look of the food, the look, the color, the artificial flavor, and we've lost the nutrients, the vitality that has to start with the soil. And we really do need to get across this message to every level of government and business, that shifting towards those more localized systems is really the only way that we're going to be able to deliver healthy, nutrient-rich food to people and move away from a planet that is dying, and a planet where the epidemics of depression, along with the epidemic of obesity, is a consequence of an economic system that has encouraged bigger and bigger scale, longer and longer distances, and ended up creating corporations that are so big that most people inside those corporations are not able to look at their impact on people or nature. I am absolutely convinced that the majority of CEOs, the majority of ministers in government would prefer to help shift things towards greater health for their children, for themselves. But they're locked in assumptions about efficiency, about the impossibility of doing the right thing. What's needed is a bigger picture. When you step back and you look at the grassroots, and that means you look closer to the ground, so you understand what's going on from the ground itself to the people, to the transport, the infrastructure. Why are we continuing to build up more and more global infrastructure when we should actually be focusing on rebuilding the local infrastructure everywhere?
Beautifully said. And I love your idea about the concept of an activist eater, an activist consumer who can really drive some of this change. And I want to go back to diet-related diseases for a moment, because you talked about diabetes, also heart disease, obesity, of course. And these have, as you pointed out, have had a huge impact on how people either get COVID or recover from COVID, or unfortunately die from COVID. Diet-related diseases are growing among indigenous communities because they have, lost some of their ways of doing things, including, growing food. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the inequality that exists when we're looking at it here in the United States? We talk about Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, the BIPOC communities who've been ignored for so long, and now, partly thanks to COVID, we're sort of waking up to the inequality and lack of access to healthy food that they have faced.
Well, everywhere in the world we can see that inequality, and we see that people, particularly of color, have been marginalized and treated, starting off with slavery, starting off with genocide. And when we look at how this started, again, it's so important to understand that when the modern economy started, and we need to go back earlier than the Green Revolution to look at how destructive this economy is, to look at the enclosures in Europe where people were driven off the land to become cheap labor for what slaves had produced on the other side of the world. So we set up a system where global traders benefited. Now, I'm very keen that we all look at what that has meant for all of us. Now, for people of color, it was worse from the beginning. It is worse now. And we need to recognize that, and we need to be trying to work together to change that. But it's about changing the system. It's not about suddenly saying, well, you people of color have to lead the way. So many of those people are struggling, to pay the mortgage, etc. So it's not about shifting the color of people who are going to be continuing systemically to move us in a direction of suicide. And the suicide is to believe that more and more global trade is the answer to growing the economy. That may sound very distant and maybe not very real, but when you understand it fundamentally, and the best way to understand it is by looking at food. It's this pressure, which started with slavery and enclosures, to produce for global traders. And by the way, those men who started it were white men who were overtly racist, misogynist, and anti-nature. Now that system has grown into not just some white men, but these giant corporations and banks that are operating globally. And they are the problem that we're facing because they're pushing systemically in the same direction. And it's marginalizing not just people of color, it's marginalizing more and more and more people. And now we've just got to look at that system together. Let's all try. Let's not get too involved in Me Too or in BIPOC, or let's look at how can we together change the system and make sure that we are clear about that fundamental racist and misogynist nature of this system. Let's not forget that. Let's not leave that out of the picture, but let's make sure that the end result is that we work together for the systemic change that we all need.
Thank you. You mentioned, how mayors and local governments are changing in many places, and that they're often taking the lead on things like the climate crisis or local and regionalized food systems. How can we encourage more of those kind of enlightened policymakers?
Well, from my point of view, it's all about, well, I say all, nothing is all, but I'd say 90% is about spreading the bigger picture. It's about information and education. And it's public education. It's now. It's not just going into schools and thinking we can start there. We're at this point after COVID now, where are we going to continue allowing the whole world to keep rushing on a path towards more globalized competition and trade, that the systemic path is not only based on racism and misogyny and anti-nature sentiments fundamentally, but even though most people inside the corporations and banks that are leading the way are no longer racist or misogynist, the system is fundamentally anti-nature. It's fundamentally anti the more nurturing feminine principles. So we have a systemic path that is disastrous, and it's now looking at how can we put even more satellites in the air. How can we win the race to go to Mars, to get even more minerals for this out of control, exaggerated male competitive path? We need to understand that we have to step back to look at the big picture to see where are the key points we can intervene. What is it that's driving this system in such a crazy direction when I really believe that the majority of people don't want it? The majority of people would prefer to have subsidies, taxes, regulations, support healthy soil, healthy food, healthy, meaningful livelihoods, and livelihoods for all, a fair and more just world. What is it that's going wrong? It's the fundamental economic trajectory. We need to be demanding that our governments stop deregulating and subsidizing global competitive trade and start shifting those subsidies, regulations, and taxes to deregulate a lot of economic activity at the local, regional, and national level. To deregulate is being overregulated. With much of the regulation comes from trying to control large-scale toxic production, but most of that's happening on the other side of the world now. So that's been deregulated so that giant corporations are condemned to rush around the globe looking for the cheapest labor and looking for conditions where there are no constraints, no regulations or rules of any kind. We need to bring the economy home. We need to be looking at that mechanism whereby governments shape the economy. And with that, they are shaping the world. They are shaping nature and human nature. As we start going towards the more localized path, and start rebuilding the smaller businesses, we're actually creating economies that are naturally more collaborative, naturally. It's not suddenly changing our values. We're not suddenly becoming noble. But as we start creating those more human scale, interdependent ways of doing things, where we can see each other, where we can see both the harm and the benefit of what we do, in those more localized structures, we naturally become more accountable and more responsible and happier. That's what we call economics of happiness.
Oh, that's so important. I'm glad that you mentioned happiness. Before I ask the final questions, I want to make sure that people know how to get in touch with you. Information and awareness is what you do best. They can go to localfutures.org. You can also find Helena's book, Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh, on the Local Futures website. Correct, Helena?
That's right. And I also would urge people to tune into our website to follow World Localization Day. We have decided to try to make visible this amazing localization movement around the world. And we nominated the June 21st, which is the solstice, as the day in which people can celebrate local economies. We'll be doing a lot online because during COVID, of course, it's not possible to do as much together outside as we would like to see in the future. But I really hope people would tune in to feel informed, grounded, and inspired that not only is another way possible, but it is starting to happen. There's so much evidence that this is what people want, this is how they thrive. And really, for me, the tragedy is that the dominant channels of communication, and I mean most of what's happening in mainstream academia, mainstream media, we don't see this. We're clouded still by a speedy, competitive, and false view of human nature, a false view of what's going on around the world. And I recommend very highly a new book called Humankind, which talks about the fact that actually by nature, we actually prefer cooperative relationships rather than competition and stress. Of course we do.
Of course. So my final question, Helena, is what makes you most hopeful right now?
Well, I mean, what makes me most hopeful is the knowledge that it's possible to do things differently and being in touch with people who are getting involved in this movement. And I'm particularly privileged at my age to be in touch with a lot of young people who have started farming. And they can really only do so in a meaningful way in the localized food systems. But I know so many of them around the world, from China to Australia to America. And I see healthier, happier young people doing work that they really enjoy, and they're able to earn a decent living, and very importantly also to be respected and loved for that work. But that's really only in the more localized food economies that this happens. And they are still a bit of an enclave because of the hidden mechanisms our governments are using to support old, dead food from far away. The fresh, local, healthy food is often more expensive. So our work is to raise awareness so that more of this can happen and that we will see policy change to make healthy, fresh food available for everybody.
Wonderful. It was such a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. You are my hero, and thank you for all that you've done and all that you do. I really appreciate talking to you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for what you're doing.